Sure. Welcome to today's information session. Welcome to today's information session. Before we start, a reminder that this workshop is being live streamed, and while it's open to the public, it is for staff to provide guidance to elected members, and it's not a forum for debate or decisions. It's also not a forum for the public to provide input into decisions or to bring other matters to the attention of council. If a member of the public does want to provide input, please talk to staff and they can help you have your say. So, welcome Jane Cameron and Chris Maran for a briefing on the Mass Rapid Transit update. Good morning.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and kia ora, councillors. So we've got an update today on where we're at with the Mass Rapid Transit project. This will look familiar from earlier in the day. So just a brief recap slide. You're all very familiar with the city shaping project, but in terms of where we're at, as a quick recap, you'll recall that the indicative business case was completed last year and endorsed by all the Greater Christchurch partner councils and approved by the NZTA board. And the key feature that was confirmed in the IBC is this preferred 22-kilometre corridor along a city spine that runs between Belfast, through the central city, and then through to Hornby. And that protecting that is going to be the focus of the next part of this project. In terms of a project update, we have briefed you previously that the project leadership for the MRT project for this next phase is transition from the Transport Agency to CCC, and that transition started at the very end of last year. As I said, the focus will be on protecting the route, protecting that corridor, and it's a pretty chunky piece of work, and I'll get into that in a minute. We're also going to give an update, I guess, on the building blocks, the program that we've got in place with our colleagues at ECAN to progress PT Futures. So we're going to cover off where that's at as well in terms of the planning and it's that precursor to MRT, building up the patronage to get from A to B. So route protection, it's 22-kilometre route protection exercises is a pretty significant piece of work. We need to get together quite a lot of evidence on top of the indicative business case work that was prepared, but that gives us a really good, really good body of knowledge to bounce off. We're currently at a scoping stage, and a lot of what we're scoping is this next stage, which is the design development stage, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute, but that's really zeroing in on the parts of the corridor where land acquisition may be required and firming that up. You can see that we move then through to assessment of effects. There'll be engagement with stakeholders and affected landowners, through to the notice of requirement and the RMA process that will follow that. So it's worth noting at this stage that the stage of work that we're in right now, we're planning for that to be undertaken in-house with using staff time, existing OPEX budgets that can be prioritised towards this. So there is funding from in the LTP, both ourselves and also ECAN from between 27 and 30. As some councillors have raised, there is the potential to consider bringing that forward in future annual plan processes. But that, I think, working out what the work is and the scale of that will be important as a first part of that process. And in terms of that initial focus, we're looking to focus in on parts of the corridor where further work is required to identify land requirements. There's a couple of spaces there. One is high risk parts of the corridor that require significantly more investigations and testing of options, and the other I guess basket of work is around land requirements, around stations and interchanges, intersections and structures on that corridor. we've pulled out a couple of examples just to illustrate the sorts of work that we're going to need to do. So that higher risk parts of the corridor, there's quite a lot of work to do around Hornby in particular, because there is uncertainty at this stage around future layout of local roads, state highway, railway networks and surrounding land use. There is a critical interdependency here with the work that NZTA is kicking off in its Hornby and Airport Surrounds Access Study. And we are making sure that we're well embedded with staff who will be working across both projects in our own local area planning exercises. Equally, in the central city, the indicative business case didn't land on where the preferred station would be around the interchange. There's still work to do there, and we've called out a couple of structures examples there as well. So the Riccarton railway crossing is a really good example, particularly if light rail was the preferred option. An overbridge probably would be required there as an example. So there's a bunch of stuff that we need to do, but that's just to give you a feel for the sorts of technical work that we're going to need to really dig into in this next phase of the work. So as I mentioned earlier, the building blocks really important part of getting us from A to B in terms of making the investment case for MRT is continuing to roll out the PT Futures program. We're partway there. We mentioned earlier the launch of the Route 7 Hallswater Queen's Park service uplift is a really significant milestone there, but there's plenty more to do, and the next slide will kind of look under the hood a little bit in terms of what that program looks like. Now, as I said, there's a fair bit going on here, but we are working really closely with our colleagues at ECAN to put together a joint program of work to progress the PT Futures program. As I said, we've got the current program, the Route 7 uplift, our own low cost, low risk program that we're progressing through the annual plan. But we also need to get ahead of some of the detailed business case work for the next stage of the PT Futures rollout. And there's a couple of routes where we're jointly planning with ECAN, routes 1 and 5, and that is, if you draw across, just as a reminder of what routes 1 and 5 are, because I know we often throw the terms around. So we're looking from Rangiora through to Cashmere, and which is that 1 or 5? 1. 1, thank you. And 5 is the Rolleston Hornby through to New Brighton. So those are the foundations routes that still require that uplift and supporting infrastructure. So that's a big part of the focus. So the idea is to kind of get that rolling investment program going. Of course, this is an indicative picture. There will still be the making the case to become a priority through the GPS land transport program, etc., that we go through as a matter of course. But at this point, it's trying to ensure that we're best dressed in the lead up to the next triennium. And then finally, next steps, finalising the route protection program planning and getting going on that design work and that integrated planning with the other processes that I was talking about before. Getting that really structured PT delivery work program and planning cycle tight with our partners at ECAN. One thing that I haven't put there is also an important part of this is maintaining a national profile for this work. We've submitted into the Infrastructure Commission's national infrastructure pipeline process for the MRT and PT Futures to get that on the national radar, and upcoming work in the city and regional deal space will be important as well. And of course, it's a big project, and we'll be looking to provide progress updates on a semi-regular basis to councillors as we continue to substantively progress the work. So open for questions.
Thank you very
and
much.
I have my
And I mean,
technical support blanket here as well, and Chris.
Yeah, and it just shows us how much time and basically time goes into this planning for these things. It's years and years and years. So we are in the planning stage, but we're trying to get ahead of the game as our population is increasing and getting ready for this public transport requirement. So questions from Victoria?
Oh, thank you. Can you go to your building blocks slide?
Yeah.
So I see on number 3 you've got the PT Futures unfunded.
Yep.
Can you now overlay that, please, onto the next slide and tell me on that timeline from 1 to year 9 where it is that we run out of funding? How far does our funding take us?
At this point in time, we still have our own the LTP program, which is we've got a program of work that rolls out over the 10-year time. But in terms of, I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at it. One is the elements that have confirmed subsidy versus the elements that are planned out in council LTPs. So from a subsidy perspective, the only element that has government National Land Transport Program funding at this stage is the Route 7 uplift, and the rest of the work that we're doing through this triennium will be largely through ratepayer funding. We'll be looking to get co-funding over time. Does that make sense?
So is it 2027 basically that's when you're planning to do the 1 and 5 uplift, isn't it?
I think Lynette.
Lynette.
To add a little bit of context, the NLTP funding is in 3-year trienniums, so we only ever know that in 3-year breaks. So the NLTP funding at that first break, our program within the 10-year program is out into 10 years, so we've still got 7 or 8 years of program ahead of us. That will be renewed and updated at the next LTP. So the red block is really beyond the 10-year period of the LTP that we've got at the moment. Does it make sense? Yeah. But it's still in the planning. It's just not.
Hang on. So the red block beyond the LTP, beyond the first 3 years of the LTP, or beyond the whole 10 years?
Beyond the 10 years. We've got a 10-year program, and PT Futures is there's a big chunk of it in the 10-year program. There's more to do out in years 11 to 15, I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Good question. Yanni?
Thank you. So the Minister thinks that we stopped work on the business case in February 2024. Have we clarified with the Minister around why he said that and what we're actually doing? Because I'm really confused.
Yeah, okay, that's the question. Can we have an answer? Do you know the answer, or Lynette?
I personally don't know the answer. I'll defer to the Head of Transport, who may or may not know the answer.
I think that came up yesterday, and I think it was disputed whether we've stopped working on it or not.
So the Minister wrote back and said his advice was that we'd stopped work. We provided you with further advice that demonstrated that we hadn't. So that's all we can... It's all detailed in the memos that came back to you.
Understood that we've got the memo back. Has anyone clarified with the Minister that we did not stop work?
Can I just ask the Chief Executive to comment on that?
With NZTA, haven't we?
But the Minister's the one that's written to both Jim Palmer and to Councillor Templeton around this with it appears, factually incorrect statements that we stopped work on this.
We can follow up and check whether NZTA have advised the Minister.
Thank you, that'd be great.
So in terms of funding, it would be quite helpful just to understand who's contributing. Is there a table that we can get that shows what the costs are and how they're being funded and what's being unfunded? And also, given that this is to the benefit hugely of Selwyn and WIMAC, what contribution are they making to this program of work?
So is it possible to get something to show a little bit more transparency?
Yep, we can come back with that.
Thank you, that's great, Jane, thank you.
What are Selwyn and WIMAC contributing
I
to
think
this
she's
work?
captured that.
We can come back with that, Councillor.
Councillor
So-
McClellan, did you have a question? I wasn't
Sorry, can I
sure.
just clarify then? I'm just what's really confusing for me is that we've got the public futures PT thing that had a whole bunch of actions in it.
Yep.
Then we've got the MRT, and then we've got budgets that are all sort of not quite clear what budget's being allocated to what progressing what.
Yeah, I
So
think that, yeah.
getting bus services back into like the east, which were cut by ECAN, my understanding was that was a work program for
Well, that's a
PT Futures.
question again that you're asking. I think you've asked that this morning. So we'll just concentrate on getting the data that you want
Right.
in the
But in terms of going forward, NZTA transferring this project to CCC, why was it transferred to CCC and not Greater Christchurch Partnership, given, again, this is a Greater Christchurch Partnership?
I think the way to look at it, Councillor, is it's been transferred as a CCC lead on behalf of the Greater Christchurch Partnership. Because, that 22 kilometre corridor is within Christchurch
district.
city boundaries. And once we get into the detail of that, that's work that we need to be leading. So that's why.
Thank you.
Cool.
Councillor
Thank you.
McClellan.
My questions are a little more detailed. The things you've picked up on the work you've done, whether we need overbridges in Main North Road and Riccarton Road, are they kind of within the ballpark of the project budget or the estimated budget, or are they substantially different to what we've kind of accounted for to date?
That's part of the detailed work. So there is, the indicative business case takes you so far. Doing some more detailed work to really hone in on, particularly at this stage, the land requirements for a designation process is that first part.
And
So-
earliest that'll be complete is 2027.
What was that?
Is
Sorry?
the earliest that work will be complete 2027?
That's likely, but we're still working through the detailed timelines as we really start zeroing in on the meat of those tasks, if that makes sense.
Right.
We're kind of helicoptering it at the moment.
Sure.
So we'll be able to provide more detail in terms of the timeline in a subsequent update to councillors.
Cool. How frequently are you planning on doing these updates?
Well, I think I've said they're on a semi-regular basis, but I guess we can be led by councillors in terms of quarterly, how if that
No
would be
preference, I
useful.
was just
Yeah.
curious. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It
Thank
probably
you for that.
really depends on when you've got
It does.
significant
something
change,
substantive
additional
to say.
information to
Yeah.
share with us, but as often as you can would be great.
The loss of the government funding is pretty significant. Maybe we actually need a decision-making report to the council so we can be really clear about what we're agreeing to progress. Because at the moment, I just have no idea.
Do
You've got to
you
progress
have a
with work
comment
to
on
get it
that,
funded,
Mary?
right?
Was that reported through when we were revisiting the budgets in LTP?
It was never assumed that we had it in any of the budgets. So it was reported quite regularly that we didn't think that we didn't have it, we hadn't had access to it. In past LTP, particularly the LTP conversations.
My understanding is we agreed to the low cost, low risk stuff, but we've never talked about the bigger stuff being funded through, given that we've lost the government funding.
We'll go back and look what's formally been reported to council, and if we need to provide an update just to confirm what's been reported, and clarify anything, we'll do that.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Mark.
Thank you. I would be picking that in the process you're kind of working through at the moment, things like the Hornby Master Plan would be quite a big piece of the thinking that we've got to try and formulate and land out west. Because the community are extremely keen to see that, some visibility as to where that's going and how we can work towards that. Because there'd be a number of partners, I'd imagine, that'd be right with NZTA and local commercial interests, which would potentially be hosts for interchanges and station infrastructure and that sort of thing.
There's lots of things to determine through those three processes, councillor, both the local area planning exercise, the project that NZTA are leading, on Hornby and airport surrounds and the state highway network component,
Yep.
as well as making sure that the MRT project is really embedded in there. So planning for those interdependencies is an incredibly important part of doing that in a smart and efficient way. So, yeah.
Big piece of
Certainly, from a community point of view, they'd be really quite keen to have a bit of a glimpse as to what processes are in play and timeframes of expectations, those sort of things.
That's probably
And
something.
then thinking about the Route 5 uplift, and with that, the bus priority sort of lane planning, because it's all very well to do a uplift for 10-minute services on a service like Route 5, but if you don't have the bus lane infrastructure in place to allow it to move, it's kind of pointless. So that, I guess that's all kind of tied up with that PT Futures unfunded piece.
That's exactly right. So the joint program that we were talking about with around the routes 1 and 5 with our colleagues at ECAN will very much be looking at both the service uplift component and the options for the supporting infrastructure uplift as well.
That gets into the fun zone, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, Victoria, I think that's the last question.
Thank you. A follow-up from Jake's question really around the funding and the budget. Just for my own clarification, am I hearing correctly that we have funding on budget for the detailed business case and the operational costs for our resources to do that piece of work, but that the land acquisition, the next stages of it for land acquisition or any construction is currently unfunded?
That's right. So
And of those two components, land acquisition and then the construction of the projects themselves, are both of those capable of being funded from central government, or are we going to have to bear the costs of land acquisition ourselves? Or we don't know yet?
I can't answer that question right now. I think at this stage we're just looking to, at the first instance, determine what are the land requirements. Yeah.
Because if we haven't done the work, you don't know what we're asking for anyway. And the only question I had was, are we considering, particularly around that Hornby work, park and ride facilities? Be part of that?
Park and ride.
The indicative business case included park and ride at the northern end, so Belfast end. It didn't actually include a park and ride at the Hornby end, though.
So it might be quite good if we can get that message through, because I know that Waimakariri, when they put their park and ride in, they've got two, one in Rangiora and one in Kaipoi. They're full. They're going really well. And they've only been in, 2 or 3 years, I think. So I think park and ride is a huge consideration that we need to make sure there's a provision for that.
And that's one of the things where I think the commercial partners, like the local shopping mall, the hub, would be open to those sort of conversations.
Yep.
I
So
think-
final question from Sarah.
Thanks. So for us to be able to get on with this work, you mentioned earlier the potential. At the moment, we don't have any funding in this financial year that's allocated for the getting on with that work, planning for the route designation, those kind of things. But you'll be providing some information for the annual plan so that we can do some work on this next year. I know that GCP partners are keen.
Yeah. At this point, we're looking to progress it through staff time.
Yeah, but staff time is resourcing.
Yep.
Yeah, but so if we're progressing this when we weren't planning on doing it beforehand, so a year ago, what then drops from the work that staff would have been doing otherwise? And if we chose to progress both things, what resourcing would be required? Because we do have funding sitting out there a couple of years. Yeah,
We'll
we could
come
bring
back with some
a small
advice
amount
in
forward.
time for the annual
We will,
plan.
yeah.
Yep.
So I've put a question through in the AP thing, but yeah.
Yeah, so Mary said she'll bring some advice back. Super interesting. Thank you, and really helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, councillors.
And we'll look forward to further updates when we see progress. So that brings us to the morning tea break. So we'll be back here at 11:15, please. waiting, so I think we'll kick away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Way, welcome, Phil. We just started.
Morning.
Afternoon.
Just shush.
We'll get you a water.
Oh, yes, you would want.
I think we're up to that. Just started. We haven't started.
A subdivision, is it? Is that where we are? Good. Oh, you can turn yours off.
So your daughter-in-law can't hear me. You don't want your daughter-in-law see if you can hear me.
Yeah. Right. Good morning, everyone. Now, I'd just like to give anyone some pointers that wants to get up early in the morning. Make sure you have the words AM after 6 o'clock on your phone rather than PM. Life goes a lot better for you. So here we are. We've got item 3, subdivision approval process. So we've got Lynette and Mark. So fire away, please.
Kia ora koutou, welcome back from the Easter break. Yes, Mark and I are here today. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate Mark on his recent appointment to the Head of Transport. I'm going to do that in public. Head of Planning, yes, sorry, Head of Planning. I'll give him the right job too, Head of Planning. Sorry about that.
He's surprised as well.
Yeah. What did I say? Transport, yes, no. Oh, he doesn't want that job, Head of Transport. Today we're coming to talk to you about the subdivision process, the road investing process, and the approvals process that we are going through. We've only got about 6 or 7 slides today, so we are going to keep it reasonably high level, and we wanted to allow plenty of time for questions and answers. We've had some recent legal advice, so you can imagine this process. We're dealing with an RMA process and an LGA process, so there's 2 interlinked processes, and Mark's going to talk a lot more about the RMA parts of the process. But we've had some recent legal advice around the technicality of approvals following some questions that were raised. So part of today is to run through the whole process for subdivisions, planning and subdivisions. What we have been going through, or the process that we have been using around these approvals, the issues that have come up, and the changes that we're looking to make to the process moving forward. So I'm going to firstly hand over to Mark.
So before we get into the detail, I'll just talk through the planning that occurs at different scales. In the context of the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan and thereafter the Ōtautahi Christchurch Planning Programme, I've spoken about spatial planning occurring at different scales, from the sub-regional of the Greater Christchurch to the city to area to neighbourhood and eventually to site level. And that reflects the development process from zoning through to subdivision, which I'll come on to. But planning at the spatial planning, which is generally non-statutory, is fundamental to achieving an integrated approach between land use and development and the staging of infrastructure to achieve a better outcome. We've got examples from as early as the 2000s of spatial planning. Firstly, the Greater Christchurch Spatial Plan in 2007, the Southwest Area Plan from 2008, and the Belfast Area Plan from 2009. And those 2 area-based spatial plans for Belfast and Southwest was in recognition of those areas being significant for growth and planning for greenfield development to support the long-term population demands of the city. With that spatial planning at the Southwest and Belfast areas, it provides a basis for planning at a more localised scale, and those area plans have informed the planning that we do in conjunction with zoning of land. So in planning for the greenfield areas, this example being between Horswell Road and Sparks Road, in zoning of that area for residential and commercial, we've obviously enabled development to occur and the transition from a rural land use to residential. But that doesn't occur in isolation of our consideration of how the infrastructure is going to be set out, and The image on the right is an outline development plan, which is typical of a greenfield area where we set out, amongst other things, the infrastructure connections to the existing road network. The black dashed lines on that image represent indicatively where the future roads would go. It identifies other aspects, including areas for development, open space, and stormwater, amongst other things. And by preparing a plan at that scale, it can inform and achieve a more integrated approach than just going straight to subdivision without any idea of how the whole greenfield area will function. The risk of not doing this approach of spatial planning at a greenfield area level, or even at a wider level, is that each landowner would come forward for a subdivision consent without any guidance for staff on how that is to be integrated with a subdivision on adjoining land. And a worst case scenario would be each landowner building a cul-de-sac into their parcel of land without roads joining up, and you're having a central spine road that serves multiple lots. It's a requirement of the regional policy statement that we have outlined development plans for these greenfield areas, but even so, it's good planning and is common sense. So when we get to this scale of subdivision consent being applied for, it's anticipated that the subdivision will occur in general accordance with the outlined development plan. There are fixed elements on the outline development plan where there's limited, if any, flexibility, and aspects of the outline development plan where there is some flexibility. But ultimately, the outline development plan provides a starting point for assessing a subdivision such as this, including the location of roads, infrastructure, and other elements. And any departure from the outline development plan is assessed through that subdivision consent process. Any subdivision of land in a greenfield context requires resource consent, and there's a range of matters that will be assessed at the stage when we're working at the scale, and that includes the design of the subdivision, the transport network, servicing and infrastructure, including its appropriateness, as well as suitability of the land. And just to draw out some key elements of the types of things we consider, the compatibility of the pattern of subdivision proposed within the area like this with the adjoining area, the integration of the subdivision and its connection to and within the site, but also surrounds, and whether, and most importantly in this context of transport, whether the location, design, safety and efficiency of any road, frontage, road access, intersections, including formation and construction, is suitable and appropriate to council. So through the subdivision consent process, we are assessing the suitability and appropriateness of what is proposed by the developer in their subdivision consent application. So that's just some context to this flow chart, which starts with the outline development plan, but recognising planning starts before that. We'll often have a pre-application meeting or discussion with the developer who's coming forward to seek a subdivision, and they'll present an early concept. We'll provide advice on how it aligns with the outline development plan and how it connects with the existing infrastructure. That draws in input from our infrastructure teams so we can consider what the capacity is and other matters. And then subject to that feedback being addressed, we then see a revised plan submitted as part of the resource consent application for the subdivision. And as part of that application process, that's assessed against the district plan. The majority of subdivision is either a controlled activity, meaning it must be granted, or restricted discretionary, where we can grant or decline it, with the matters that we can assess as part of that subdivision being limited to what's defined in the plan. Having said that it's limited, there is a relatively comprehensive list of matters that we assess as part of any application, and I've alluded to some of those in the previous slide. Council, in the context of a subdivision consent application, we're working in the context of the Resource Management Act, and we have statutory responsibilities within the context of that legislation, one of which is to process an application within 20 working days. That means making a decision within 20 working days of receiving the application. That an application can go on hold if further information is requested, but once we've had that further information and are satisfied we've got sufficient information, then the clock starts again. So as you can imagine, 20 working days is a tight turnaround. The consent will be granted with conditions, and those conditions range from access, connections, and other aspects. And at that point, after the consent has been granted, I understand practice to date has been that there's been a briefing of the community board. The developer, after they've got consent, they've got a level of certainty, A, that consent has been granted and they can initiate further work, and B, that they can invest in what has been approved. So they'll commence detailed design and work through the design process, consider compliance with the council's infrastructure design standard, which has been adopted by council, as well as how they achieve compliance with the conditions of the resource consent. In doing so, they'll undertake a safety audit, and alongside all of this, in greenfield situations, there will more often than not be a cost share agreement between the developer and council and or other developers over infrastructure, who's paying for what, how costs are split, and so forth. And thereafter, the construction of the asset, which is later vested with council. Now, just touching on a couple of aspects, after the subdivision consent has been granted, they will come back with a plan which represents the subdivision and what they'll later seek titles on, and that plan council has to certify under a section of the Act known as 223 as to that being in accordance with the consent. And then later on, once they've completed and the construction and complied with all the conditions of the resource consent, they come back for a certification under section 224 of the Resource Management Act, which is again a certification process that council approves that it's satisfied with what has been implemented.
Sorry, before you change that slide, so Mark alluded to where do transport come into this, and the big part of it is when the transport team get involved with the interface between the subdivision and, if you go back to that one, the interface between the subdivision and the existing road network. Yes, so that the small diagram in the corner there has a highlight of where it's interacting with the road network. Now, IDS requires upgrade of that frontage. So the idea is, if that's currently a rural site or a rural road, that might have a footpath added. It will probably definitely have curb and channel added. There may be pedestrian islands, but we're also looking at the safety of the intersections into and out of the subdivision itself. One we've talked about before is the signalised intersection on Motorhead Road with Preston Subdivision. So that's all of that interface is where the team from Transport will get involved. Now, I do understand that community board briefing, that could happen anywhere between that process. It's sort of a bit of the current processes that floats around in that engineering approval process. Usually once the plans are done and we brief the board, and the issue is then we come back for approval, but it's retrospective approval often after it's built. That is where we've had the advice. That is not, let's move to the next one, is not where we want to go. So the subdivisions that we've got, and I have got Anna has sent through or put on the big tin can for you a list of all the subdivisions that we've got and where they and the boards that they sit with. The predominant workload with these, with getting these reports approved, sits out with the Hornsby-Riccarton board. There are a lot of subdivisions that are in stages that are being implemented at the moment, but also with the Fendleton, Harewood Waimari board with the Belfast work. So there's a number out in the Belfast, Bishopdale area that also need approvals. But most boards have at least one development in them that we need to work through this process. Now, the legal advice is largely along the lines, to summarise, is there's two parts to these. There's the subdivision that's being built on private land, and there's the areas that are interacting with the existing road network. The community boards, read community boards and council, in relation to our delegations that we have for approvals of work, the community boards have no powers over the new roads until they are vested with council. So they are a private development until they're vested with council. At the time that they're vested with council, we need to do a report to legalise the no stopping and the giveaways and the stop signs, the lines and signs. We need to do some form of approval of that so that once they're vested, they're enforceable. The other part of it, the work that is undertaken on the existing road to interface with that subdivision, between that subdivision and the existing network, yes, does need community board approval, and it needs to be done ideally ahead of the work being done. This is requiring a bit of a change for us with our process and what we're going on with. The next slide does that. Hang on, I'll go back. But looking at the list of subdivisions that we've got, what we've got to prioritise them. We are going to look to ensure that anything that hasn't started work or has very recently started work gets through to the boards as soon as possible, so that they can be legalised and moving through. They can be the resolutions can be in place and they can move forward with surety. The developers can. Where we're looking to get retrospective approvals because the work's already been done, we are still prioritising it, but it is not the top of the chain if that makes sense. I'm happy to take feedback on that prioritisation if necessary. The team are working to undertake and get all of the reports done, and they are looking to get them through the boards over the next 3 months. So there is going to be an influx of reports, particularly out at Horseville Hornby Riccarton over the next few months to get these through the system so that you then are aware of what's happening on the network. So the changes that we're proposing to make in the process, we are actually, instead of just having a community board briefing, so the planning team are bound by the 20-day response period. To hold that process up is really difficult, and the challenges for the community boards are that those interfaces, and those usually involve conditions. That's fair to say, isn't it? They're usually a result of conditions on the consent. So what we are proposing is that once the scheme there is a scheme plan there is a scheme in place, it might be a plan, it might be a description, that goes to the community board as a report. So to get in principle approval for the development that's happening and the changes that are proposed to be made to the network. They won't be detailed at that stage because they won't have done the engineering approval. What the developers are telling us is they want some certainty that the work they're proposing moving forward into the engineering phase, that's what will be built, and that's what they are expected to build. So they want some certainty over the work they're expected to do, because that phase for them is an expensive phase. And then before we start construction, we will undertake a report that has the detailed traffic resolutions that should be in line with the plan that was approved. If there's any difference to that, it would be explained in that report. Those detailed traffic resolutions would only be enacted once the construction had either been completed on the existing road network or the roads had been vested in council, and we'd be wrapping up the process there. The Mark and his team are looking at how do they communicate this with the development community and ensure that the process is in the system and we can move it through. In some ways, many of you will have seen the reports for the road naming come through your reports. In some ways, it's building on that report, and it's just tying up the entire process. So that's what we're planning and proposing. The next 3 months, particularly out at Horseville Hornby Riccarton, you'll be seeing our team a lot. 3 or 4 months, we're hoping to do it in 3 months. They're planning to do it in 3 months. So that's the rest of the slides. There are a number of other slides in your pack that have got the word detail of what we've tried to explain, and there is the attachment, which I have some printouts if you want afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynette. Right, we've got some questions. Victoria first, please.
Thank you. Lynette, can you just put up that slide that had the interface, that highlighted yellow area? So it's reasonably obvious where there's an immediate interface where it's an adjacent to a subdivision. But often what's happening is that the subdivisions, which are quite sizable, have an enormous impact on the roading network beyond that immediate interface. And I ask this question because in our recent community board area, we had a presentation about some developments over the Prestons Way on the edge of the CNC corridor, so Ngaitahu land. So that they're going to have a significant impact on the surrounding network, not just the immediately adjacent interface. So my question is, at what point in the process do you look at and talk or assess the impact on the wider roading network as a result of that increased development?
So as part of the plan change process, before we zone land, recognising it goes through a statutory process, there's an assessment of the effects that a development such as the whole of that greenfield area would have on the wider network. That's subject to transport assessment, which is then presented amongst all the other material to a hearings panel or commissioner, and that comes back to council to then make a decision on whether to accept that recommendation or not. So at the macro level, there's an assessment at that scale. Even before that, we've done some high-level modelling of transport effects cumulatively across the area, but it starts to be more tangible at the level where we zone land. And that can give rise, through a plan change process, to rules that development cannot proceed until there's an upgrade of certain intersection. So there are rules that exist in the district plan, and I can think of rules that have existed for Prestons about upgrades that have been required before development proceeds beyond a certain threshold, and that threshold has been based on the number of residential units.
Okay, thank you. I'm just anticipating the community board reports that come. I do have another couple of questions. The second one is in relation to the trees and the interface with the underground services. In our community board area, we've had a lot of issues with trees, whether there are power lines above or underground services. Is there any suggestion that we're moving to a model where we have trees planted on one side of the road and underground services on another side of the road, so that we're avoiding the ongoing issues with that interface between trees and underground services? I'm aware that other jurisdictions operate in that, some other cities operate on that basis. Have we given any thought to that?
The infrastructure design standards, I understand, would be the method, but I'll just invite Sean Ward to the table, who's a team leader responsible for subdivisions.
Do you want to go on the end?
The short answer to that, Councillor Henstock, is yes, there is some discussion going on. So there's been a reasonably continuous set of discussions for the last year or so with the city arborists about how we deal with street trees and new development, because it has been causing, so not just established street trees, but street trees and new developments, and width of berms and the sorts of trees that we can plant, and the conflicts with services. So there is some work underway to try and generate a simpler outcome for everyone, or a simpler process for everyone, so we get a good outcome but without the hassle.
And thank you for that. And then the second part of that question is around street trees, but not so much in the berm, but in the road, in that road corridor. I know some other cities also do that. And traditionally we don't do a lot of street trees in the actual road curb to curb part of the corridor. Is there any movement for it to happen, bearing in mind that we're trying to increase our canopy cover?
Not that I'm aware of in relation to subdivisions. And again, as Mark said, we'd have to look at the IDS and the directives for road design to be able to do that, and there may be increases in corridor widths needed for that, because you take up a significant amount of space out of the. But,
Okay,
I mean,
the final question then is just in relation to the proposed changes to the RMA. How does that impact your process going forward?
Still awaiting detail, and from memory, there's very little commentary in the expert advisory panel's report about subdivisions, but it's a wait and see at this point until the bill lands. But certainly with replacement of the RMA with 2 acts, and it would be the domain of the Planning Act to deal with urban development, including subdivision. But details around that remains to be seen, unless Sean
Can we expect that there will be some changes to your process as a result of that? Is really the question I'm asking.
Possibly is the most I could say. The principle behind the legislation that's been spoken about is preserving property rights and allowing for the enjoyment of land. In the context of a new subdivision, that may mean that we can't require outdoor living space, outdoor service space, or matters that we're currently controlling the effects of, where the effects are limited to the property owner themselves. Where there's effects beyond the boundary, so shading on the adjoining land of a house, that obviously extends beyond effects on the property owner, so I expect we'd still be able to manage that, but it appears that...
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yep, I've got a nice long list here. Kelly.
Yeah, thanks for that information. My question's really probably for Lynette, just in terms of how do you think these changes are going to affect the situation that we ended up with in Preston's Park subdivision with essentially a dispute between council transport staff and the developer over the extra work required to put the Preston's Park drive right through to Marahau Road, and the dispute sort of seemed to drag on for well over a year, leaving a situation where there's only one outlet out of the subdivision, or 1.5, which caused immense frustration for the residents who were having to drive from the far end of the subdivision 4 kilometres out to get to the equivalent spot where they would get into town, sort of thing. Do you think that's going to change it?
I'm going to let Sean start and I'll finish.
Sorry, it's a bit of a loaded question there.
In terms of that particular example, I don't think so, because what we're proposing there in terms of when things come to the board for the changes on the road, it would be contingent on at least an in principle agreement being reached between council's transport asset team and the developer about what the works were.
Yeah.
The subdivisions are still going to be staged. The developments are still going to be staged. And the challenge in this process is when do we go, when do we not go? So we're still going to have to go and get those reports, get those approvals. I would hope that we will end up with less situations like we did at Motorho, because we'll all be clear about what's going on and what's planned for the network.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Cal.
Actually, I've just got a second question there.
Yes.
I don't ask many.
No, I don't let you have any.
Yeah, so my second question really is around the staged work in, say, Marahau Road, where subdivision outlets have been delayed, and I completely understand that it was tied to sign-off of the last stage of the subdivision. But in speaking to the roading contractor, he was saying that they were doing work on one side of Marahau Road. On the south side, they did the gutters, and they said to council staff, look, there would be a significant saving in dollars if we do the other side at the same time, but they were told that there was no budget for that, and so they didn't do it. They're now doing it at a considerable increase in cost, and they actually offered to council staff, transport staff, that they would fund it themselves, and then were happy to be paid during the next year's budget. Yet that was turned down. Yeah.
So I can't speak to the specifics of that in a public briefing, but I will say that there's very few people in the process that actually understand the whole context of what's going on, and usually the builders are not those people. The constructors are not. We deal with the developers. The contractors are contracted to the development, the companies that are delivering the development. We do everything we can when we get those cost-share agreements to ensure we can do as much work as possible and minimise the impact on the local community, so that we're not coming back. Doesn't always work. Sometimes we have to go back.
Well, just a final question. In cases where there is a dispute, is there any kind of sort of process in place whereby there's some mediation with not just the developer and transport, but perhaps coming to a better solution so that these situations don't drag on for a year, like the Preston's Park Drive interface with Marihau Road is concerned?
So all I can say is there was many issues in that specific example, in the process on both sides of the discussion, as there usually is in every dispute. We have an escalation process. When that was enacted within council, and the first part of it is to escalate it up to head of service. And when that was enacted, we got to a solution.
Yeah, true. All right, thank you.
Now, Andre will I'll let you go next, mate, because you'll have a number of questions. But I think the main thing is, because I'm lucky enough to know a little bit about how that process works, which is very good, and ODP is a fantastic thing. You're looking at buying a bit of land, you go to the council, and that's what we would perhaps like to have, or that's where the roads may go. That's good, and exactly what you said. The developer will build it to council standards and stuff like that. The council boards have no say on the land itself, but outside on the interface. And I think the main problem of what Andre's going to get to is the surprises on what happens on that little bit outside it. I think that's we're on the right track that it's going to happen. One thing I will say, that when you've got down on that picture, I think that's up there, construction of asset, it's just because the subdivision's finished it and it's vested in council, it is not out of maintenance for 12 months, and planting is not out of maintenance as far as the developer goes for 2 years. So you just don't go plonking them in and plonking in a bit of rubbish, and if it dies, so that it used to happen like that. It is a lot better now than it ever used to be. So carry on, Andre.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That's the point of us putting this report in.
Yes.
To go back to your point about not having surprises, that's the point of us
Yes.
putting
That's-
something
I'm just-
formal in the process so that there aren't surprises. And the board has some history with the discussion about what's happening on the existing network.
Correct.
Yeah.
Far away, mate.
Thank you, and thank you for all the very clear information here explaining it all. It's very, very good. But yeah, and surprises has been the hardest part I've found of all of this. My question's how we can avoid missing things along the way when things are getting approved, new subdivisions are going in. So in the example of Kennedy's Bush Road, residents have had a couple of years of roadworks, have been very patient, and then they find out there's going to be 4 raised platforms but a footpath only on one side. You can imagine how popular that was when they heard that. But you've got the contractors on site, the developers there, there's a traffic management plan in place. The cheapest time to build the footpath on the other side would be right then and there. So how can we avoid council not doing that type of work at the same time in future, rather than considering coming back to retrofit it later, which will cost a whole lot more, when we could engage in cost sharing, and if budget's an issue, then we're able to sort that. We've got development contributions for it.
So there's 2 parts to that question, if I can.
Yep, please.
So the first part, to use Kennedy's Bush Road as an example, if we had come with a report at that scheme stage, it would have highlighted that there were platforms and footpath on one side of the road and what was done. So one of the, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the premises of this is that we cannot require the developer
Understood.
to do any more than just that impacts his subdivision.
That.
So we've got that. So if we had done that process, we would have been upfront and the community board would have been aware that this was coming, and then that we would have been able to work through the building process with them. But you would have also had the detailed traffic resolutions prior to construction starting. With regard to doing work at the same time, this goes a little bit back to what Councillor Barber just raised. Those cost share agreements are a negotiation, and they're a negotiation on rates and costs. And sometimes we can't get to something that we think is a reasonable cost for doing it, or we could do for cheaper with our maintenance contractors or the contractors that we have provided. So I just can't say that always we will be able to get to that agreement, but we are always working to try and achieve that agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the question is how we might be able to improve it going forward? Because in this case, it would seem very unlikely that council would have been able to do a project like that on its own cheaper than when everyone's already there. In that case,
Logic says that, yes.
yeah.
Yes, but like I said.
Do you have an idea? This will take some time to implement, but do you have an idea on how much longer we can expect works to still get approved without board approval? Like we just had another example a couple of weeks ago.
There's some stuff going on at the moment. It's particularly around your board, unfortunately.
But I guess.
So that's why we are also focusing on getting as many of those through. So if work is about to start or is just started, we're focusing on getting those through to your board now.
Yeah.
Over the next 2 months.
Yeah, cool, makes sense, thank you. And just a bit of a curly question. For retrospectively approving things, like there's one intersection which is, since it's been changed, has been a disaster.
Yeah.
So it's like, how could I in my right mind want to approve a retrospective change? So what happens if the board doesn't approve it? Where do we actually go next?
We will have to work through that on a case-by-case basis, but with regard to, let's say, the platforms you raised on Kennedy's Bush Road, if the board didn't approve the platforms, then that would require a variation to the consent, would be my understanding, because they're listed as a condition in the consent.
If they were listed as a condition, yep.
Yeah, if they were listed as a condition in their consent, that would require a variation to the consent. So we'd have to just go through that process with the developer.
My question's more around
with the
intersection.
intersection.
Intersection change 2 years ago, for example. So it's way too late to change the consent or anything.
Yeah, and the William Britton Milnes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Intersection. With that intersection in particular, that is one of the reports that's coming soonest. Yes, big nod that back there.
So better question.
So in the next couple of weeks to the board. So we're aiming for the next meeting. Part of the challenge with that intersection is that if you go back to the IDP, that they line up. So there is actually another road that needs to get built through to Wigram Road. It's Wigram Road, isn't it?
Well, built through to Sparks Road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that will take the weight off the other road. So it's about the staging of the subdivisions as well. It's caused part of the problem there. So we're looking to address that as well in that report.
But there's also a primary school to come on Milnes Road in a few years. So
but we're looking to address that in that report.
Nice one, big question for then. And just on page 13, conditions can't be imposed on subdivisions to require infrastructure beyond the needs of the subdivision. There's some cases here, like we're able to make them build 4 raised platforms on one stretch of road, for example, outside the subdivision. I've just learnt, like on Kennedy's Bush Road, 4 raised platforms. Quaves Road, there'll be 4 raised platforms. I'm told one of them cost $165,000 for just that raised platform. So it's this huge cost on new homeowners. And then a lot of them are going to have, in some cases, have no pedestrian access in certain parts because we're not building the footpath, but they're required to fork out for these raised platforms. We're imposing a lot of infrastructure here, such as raised platforms. Are we risking legal challenges, is I guess my question. Because there's going to be a point here where developers and new homeowners are asking us what on earth is going on. Or sorry, they are asking me what's going on. Why do we have to pay for these but we don't have a footpath?
So the second bullet point on that slide's alluding to a section of the RMA 108 that prescribes what council can put conditions on in terms of subdivisions. In terms of the raised platforms, that would be to address safety of the road network, which we can manage through a subdivision process based on the scope of what the district plan allows.
So, for example, we may there's an intersection. There's an intersection proposed on a subdivision, like the bottom one in that picture up there. There may be a drain on the other side of the road.
Yeah.
And in order to actually get a safe right turn into that intersection, we can't widen the road, so we have to slow the intersection down. So, or we have to widen the road, and to widen the road, you have to fill a drain. So the team go through a really big process with Sean's team to try and understand what a reasonable change is, and that's what I anticipate you will get the information of when those reports come. So you'll understand why they're proposed, why the conditions are proposed as well. that are there, so that you're not then sitting here today like you are today going, I just don't understand this.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out where the line gets drawn. Like, if we can make them put in 4 race platforms, can we then make them put 8, 12? Like, where? Like, I'm just.
It comes back to when we're considering that consent and when the transport planners are providing us with advice. It comes back to the effects associated with the development, and so it's around the function and safety of that intersection, or the function and safety of that piece of frontage. So it's not a, although it looks quite hard and fast, it wouldn't necessarily be boom right at the fringes of the site, although providing a footpath across multiple sites to get to another footpath isn't really an effect of that subdivision, but some of those things do bleed out a little bit from the edge. Sometimes they will by condition, but it's not in every instance, and it's not the problem with conditions is often they're not quite as formulaic as you might think they would be. So
Thank you.
Thank you, mate. Yanni, please.
What I was trying to understand, like we've just had like a new Mitre 10 going in Montreal Street, for example. Did that require a subdivision consent? Because
the Mitre 10.
It's because it's
Not
basically
that I'm aware
got
of, no.
like the traffic impact is just horrific. But they're building a car park on the other side of the road, and they've got their building. So I'm just trying to understand, like, it's a bit like to Victoria's point. Like, we seem to be missing looking at the cumulative impacts of the traffic generated by these developments and what it does to the immediate road, let alone the surrounding roading infrastructure. So I'm just trying to understand where that gets considered in terms of the piece. I mean, the other one that we've had, of course, is the Kenaway Farm, where we did have an outline development plan, but that's subsequently been changed throughout its life to be more enabling of the development and didn't actually provide us with much confidence that what was supposed to happen has actually happened.
So I'll to quite separate matters, but the latter one on Kenaway, that's an example where a developer can apply for resource consent for subdivision and land use to depart from the outline development plan that's in the district plan. It doesn't change the ODP that sits in the district plan, but they can seek to, when they get subdivision consent and land use consent, they can seek to depart from it in terms of the layout or design of the roads or other aspects which we'll assess and consider what the effects are of that change. In terms of Mitre 10 Mega, we've spoken in this briefing about subdivisions, but it did need land use consent. So there's different types of consents, and this council administer land use and subdivision consents. A land use consent is where there's required where the plan specifies that an activity can't establish without consent, or that there's non-compliance with standards that apply to an activity. And in that context, there's rules which we've got about traffic generation, and if we've got limits set in the district plan around vehicles, generation of vehicles, and if it exceeds a certain limit, then it would trigger consent to enable us to assess the traffic effects of that.
Right. So in terms of like Langdon's Road, where we've seen massive development as well, big box retail development effectively.
Yeah.
That is just that's a resource consent as well, not a subdivision consent. So
yeah, ideally, when we rezone the land, like we did several years ago at Langdon's Road to enable large big box, as has occurred at North Link, as part of rezoning the land, we'd consider what the traffic effects are of that enabled development and put in place. For instance, there's a rule in the plan that if traffic exceeds a certain volume from that site, that we can then require a management plan or something to that effect. But other examples where we've, for instance, if we go back in time, one option could have been to consider a rule that required upgrade of the Grez Road, Langdon's Road intersection with traffic lights, as has occurred, and for the cost to be borne by developer.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is that, like, at what point is a subdivision consent required because of the scale of what's happening versus like just a resource consent? And is there is it just because of it's in separate title? Basically, they want to put in separate titles.
So subdivision consent is only where you are dividing allotments into more allotments. That's a subdivision consent.
Right.
So the use of the land's not necessarily tied to the subdivision. You can carry out a subdivision without triggering any land use consent provision, so you don't need a resource consent necessarily, you just subdivision consent.
Right.
They're quite separate things.
Equally, like with Kenaway, what I've been told is they've got something like an 8-year time frame to do any of the landscaping works, and they don't actually have to get a subdivision consent. So because they don't get a subdivision consent, they don't have to do the works that were required in the outline development plan. Is that?
We'll come back to you on that with reference to the conditions on the consent, which were recently provided to the board.
I can answer there's an 8-year, that time scale of 8 years. When you get a subdivision consent, the life of the consent is 5 years. So within 5 years, you need to have a Section 223 approval, which is where council signs off the survey plan, says that that's in accordance with the scheme plan, and then you have 3 more years to meet all the conditions. So on any subdivision consent of any scale, you have at least 8 years to complete the whole thing.
Right, regardless of the impacts on the community in the meantime.
Yep.
Those timeframes are prescribed in the Act. So.
Yeah, they're in the Act. So at times you may require by condition certain things to be done at a certain time, but again,
Thank you, Yanni.
Thanks for the clarity. Yeah.
Tim.
Thank you. I've cut them down to a couple. So first of all, Mary, with regards to, because you're page 13.2, under law, so conditions can't be. However, with the big picture of things, we've got areas that are being, or small subdivisions around Kashmir Road, etc. Mm-hmm. It would be unsafe to get your children or young people biking or walking on the sides of those roads. So if we're trying to stop global, the emissions, etc., the only safe way to travel from those subdivisions is by car. So I think it would be good for us to look at how we can lobby central government to change that law and require, whether it's a shared cost or whatever, for footpaths and cycle lanes from those isolated or semi-isolated subdivisions. Because at the moment, we're just doing the same old that we've done for 40 years or 50 years, and it is achieving absolutely nothing. But that's a central government thing we've got to lobby for, because that's a law change. And so I think, but we can bitch and moan about no footpaths or whatever, but it doesn't change anything. So we've actually got to look at how we change it. So, but I'm not over yet. Secondly, community boards. There is some really good information from community boards, believe it or not. But it's when that is questioned or asked for by us. And I think we've got to look at that. I know you're reviewing it, but I'd like to have some say in what that process is. Because with the third one, leading into it, is the Westmoreland cycle connection. I'd really like to talk with you and your staff with that, because that went from a hope and it's something that could be such a positive to an absolute, I thought, dog. And I ended up not being able to support the cycle connection, which is, for me, really, really hard. But it was, to use the operative district plan and John Higgins stood up and supported me with this. It was used incorrectly to not allow for this roundabout, etc. I saw it had no vision, but I need to know why the process was what it was. I think it's gone to a better place now. We are getting a roundabout at the bottom of Penruddock and Kashmir Road, which is absolutely the right place and the right thing for that site. But I really would like to sit down with staff and better understand that, because I was actually on my own with the community board voting against it, but I think it's really good to understand why and look at what we're doing in the future. So thank you.
Okay, right, we will run out of time, but I'll let Andre have a say in a minute. Still a couple. Mel, please.
I had quite a few, but actually the one is the same point as Tim's. That part where it says under law, blah, 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 primarily serve the wider community. I fail to understand how when a subdivision goes in and people can't walk from one place to another, how that's serving the outside community. It's for the people that have... that doesn't make sense. Are we misreading the law? No. I don't know. I don't know what it says, but it just doesn't make any sense.
So that's partly why when we talk about cost share agreements. So that's partly why we have growth projects in transport, we have a number of subdivision budgets, and it's about being able to join some of that up. The conversation we've had a number of times around council is about us making those decisions. Sometimes if you make those decisions ahead of a development that is proposing to come because there's an area, then you're going to undo the work that you've done and waste the money that you spent, because it would have to be provided by the next developer in the next section.
So just unpacking that a wee bit further, and with reference to this example on the screen, when we've zoned a large greenfield area, there's generally speaking been multiple landowners within that area, and it's apparent to everyone that not every landowner has the same aspirations. Some will go ahead of others, and the first developer may not be right next to the existing footpath. They may be further down, but the other landowners between that development and the existing footpath, when they come in and subdivide, they would then provide the continuation of that footpath to the existing. The alternative to that is council invests and effectively plays banker of paying for the infrastructure to go in and tries to recover that. But the difficulty is we don't know the timing of when these developments are coming forward, such that it may only be 6 months before a landowner is proposing to come forward and develop the gap. And in that context, the developer would be doing it. So does council want to invest in circumstances like that?
So yeah, it's a balancing act that we're trying to...
But it is good. You guys, everyone's thinking forward, like if there's a block of land, which I know, a block of land I know there's a bit out here that's going to be done soon. This has had extra diameter sewer pipes put in because the council knows that this one day is going to have 1,000 more toilets going down it. So the council pays the extra over, and then when this chap hooks on, he pays the money that the council paid to be able to. Otherwise, it's not, guys, it's not as if it's all one-on-one. There's a lot of thought that goes into it. And also with roading stuff, Lynette, DCs cover a fair bit of this as well, don't they? Take lots of Horswell. Every DC that's paid out there, there's a certain percentage for sewer. Yep. Because there might be 100 more toilets out in Horswell, so that's going to make 100 times different, or 100 more different input of material down at Bromley. So that is part of that DC, being able to hook onto the council system. Yep. And it's the same with roading. There's always a transport component in our DC for general and water and parks and everything. So it is covered. One thing I will say is we've got to be careful that the com boards don't have too much say. It's all very well that we go to them and say, this is on public road, what do you think about putting some speed bumps along here, and let them have their say one way or another. But we're not all roading engineers, and we don't want to be saying, but we'd like 6 more of those, and this developer will tear his hair out. So there's a fine line between happy and sad.
Yeah. I think a big thing is about the understanding of why, and the example that Councillor Moore used of the raised platforms along is the why. Why have we proposed that as a condition to connect into this subdivision, rather than, say, the example that Councillor Barber used of the traffic lights on Motorho Road. So it's the understanding why, and having that in the community board process and in their understanding, so that they can, the rest of the process, the big thing at that point is to give the developers some certainty of what they've got to do moving forward, so that they can have that.
Okay.
That's what we're really trying to achieve.
Yep, I've talked long enough. Tyrone? And then you, Mark.
Brilliant. Just from a process flow point of view purely, just the beginning of the process where the developer engages with council to the point where they start construction, what's the minimum time that takes?
So from that
minimum
early
time.
pre-app, the minimum possible time, probably 4 or 5 months.
Right.
By the time they come for that early discussion, they go away.
Minimum possible?
Well, it's not the minimum possible. You could come in for a pre-app. You could have worked through a lot of those issues and be ready to go, lodge your consent. In theory, get it back in 20 days if everything was perfect in the way it was lodged.
But it's there or thereabouts. Yeah.
But several months. I mean,
so what's the average time?
that it takes?
More, I don't know. I don't keep a record of the average time. I mean, the average time for the consents is probably around a couple of months with a greenfield consent, with a bit of backwards and forwards in the middle about detail. The pre-application might happen today. They may not lodge a consent until early next year. There's no that's developer driven rather than driven by anything that we do necessarily.
Right. The only statutory time frame in that context is the consent must be processed within 20 working days. But as I mentioned and Sean's alluding to, applications go on hold where they need to provide more information or they propose a change from what they lodged. So there can be delays.
Right, but the minimum, let's just say everything was perfect, what would be the minimum that it could go through?
Until they start construction that was the original year. So the minimum.
So not a situation where we go, oh, there's more information required or whatever. Everything's perfect and it just goes through.
Yeah, I still think 4 or 5 months, because once they've got a consent, the subdivision consent is not quite the same thing as the land use consent, in that it's really only an approval in principle, and you can't start doing any physical work until you have your engineering approval. It's called approval up there, engineering acceptance. So until all the detailed design work's done and it's been accepted by the council, you can't actually physically start work.
So do we have a view on how long it takes versus the minimum possible? Like, I mean, what I'm getting at is, like, what are the bottlenecks in our process where things get held up? Is it because, you know, not enough information is provided? Or?
That's usually the main one.
But what are the things that we can do as a council
and forwards
to help?
about provision of information and completeness of information? Arguably it could in some instances be faster through the engineering approval process, but that again often is about the provision of information and the degree to which the design satisfies all the things that it needs to.
I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, like, from a governance point of view, like, what are the things that we could do as a council in our budgets or whatever to beef up the process so that we can get things moving through the system? Is it we have people working with developers? Is that we have more people in this area?
I think the process is an issue. As Sean's touched on, it's both ways and horses for courses. There's going to be we don't live in a perfect world, so there's always going to be further information anticipated and some back and forward in achieving an outcome that is acceptable to council, but also to the developer. In terms of streamlining, council does offer a case management service where developers can effectively employ one of our case management team to identify where they can assist with unlocking some of the issues they cite, but that's a case by case basis.
And there's a lot of interaction too between agents and council staff prior to anything being lodged, whether or not a pre-application meeting happens. So that stuff does get worked through
Lynette.
So I was just going to say, I don't think the actual subdivision process itself is not the challenge that we're discussing today. It's the approvals
Correct.
of the changes,
Mm-hmm.
and the challenge from me to all of you as members of community boards is to ensure that we don't hold up that process as part of this changed approval process.
Mark, please, and then Andre.
Thank you. Coming back to community board for a briefing, does the community board actually have ability to input into that the process and look at suggesting changes at that point, or is it just purely this is the information and something?
It will be this is the subdivision. This is an idea of the subdivision and the subdivision plans, and this is a description of the proposed changes to the roading network. At that point, it is, and the developers haven't gone through the cost of designing that up. It is a chance to, a board may argue that they don't want speed platforms in, but I would be really surprised if a community board would come back and say we don't want Cuban channel and we don't want footpaths and we don't, or they'll be saying we want more.
Yep.
In which case that's then with us to work with the developer to figure out whether we can build it into the building process and get an agreement to do it.
Right.
So there's a level of influence, but it is low.
Yep.
And there is no influence over what happens inside the site.
Yep.
But it is about awareness and documenting that awareness.
Yep. I mean, one of the things I've got in mind is, of course, the retrospective approval that we've got coming back to us
Yep.
around those speed platforms, Kennedy's Bush.
Yep.
do we as a board have the ability to not approve those, and therefore you go back to the...
We would have to take them out. Yep.
Yep.
So
Okay, thank you.
there will be options. There will be options in the reports that go to discuss what the options will be, and those reports will be there. But we don't. It's not ideal that we would do that.
Thanks, Lynette. And lastly, Andre, because he was the instigator.
Thank you. Just respond to Councillor Scandra, and lobbying central government certainly wouldn't hurt, and this is speaking just about gaps in the footpath network that will never be filled in by developers, that have to be by us. There is now a budget for new footpaths, and it's 80% development contribution funded. So that is a mechanism for us to have these missing connections filled in, paid for by new developments. That's there in the long-term plan now. So we've now got a mechanism, and we're best to get on with utilising it. And we can do it at the same time sometimes as new subdivisions being built and contracts and everything are on site. But the next workshop does propose cutting that for a couple of years, which will mean that we miss out on an opportunity to utilise DCs to pay for this infrastructure and around your ways as well. So don't just, yes, it's not just bitching and moaning about it. We've literally got a mechanism there that's been developed now to start doing some of these things. And we should be ready to make progress on it. And it's easy funded, 86%.
Okay, thank you. Just very lastly for me, Lynette, take the likes of Kinneys Bush Road. You go to the community board and there's, as a guess, 300 grand's worth of speed humps. Can the board, and they're not in, can the board, under the new system, can the board say, oh, Mr. Developer, we're not happy with these, but would you mind spending 300 grand on some footpath around the corner? Is it as simple as that, or is that where you're trying to get to, Andre?
Oh, I think that's a bit simplified.
I don't know. All I'm doing is just throwing an idea out there.
No, I don't think that's what we. No, that's not what we're looking to come to the
Okay,
boards
no, that's
with.
fine. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
The options will be with the board and the implications.
Yep. So we will be back here at 1:15 to talk about CapEx deliverability. Thank you.
Well, this is live stream, so welcome back to our briefings, and I'd like to welcome Paul Dadson, Nikki and Bede to talk to us about the CAPEX deliverability. Over to you.
Thank you, Councillor Cotter and koutou katoa councillors. So look, this project, the origins of that very briefly, through the performance report that's been coming up, has been noted the uplift in capital delivery next year and the ensuing years. And so we've been doing some work on where we're heading with this. We'll preface it by saying it's looking very much at this stage at the 25-26, and as you'll see, there remain work to be done in the subsequent years, which will carry on afterwards. But I'll hand over to Paul initially and Nikki to work us through the work that we've done about how we're looking to right-size the program in terms of the annual plan that you'll be adopting at the end of June.
Thanks, Bede, and good afternoon. What we've basically done is done a review of the current draft program, and we've also done some analysis on previous year's delivery. And what I want to do is present some of that here today and then take discussion or questions. Happy to answer questions as we go if need be. So
Probably best we'll wait to the end.
Okay.
The problem is sometimes we don't get to the end if we do that.
I think we'll get to the end.
Great. Let's see.
So just what we're going to cover off today is just making sure that we're aligned with the strategic priorities, look at the program context and key drivers, some of the analysis that we've done around the deliverability. What we want to look at is core and non-core programs, some of the drivers of the core program, what's the rates impact of any changes that we're looking to make, recommendations and next steps, and then there's a list of proposed projects that we're looking to perhaps rephase. So purpose is strategic alignment. So obviously, as Bede said, we're responding to the council's request. Can we deliver the 25-26 capital program as it is in the draft annual plan? Provide some evidence-based assessment, including some historical performance to review that, and make sure we continue to be aligned with our strategic priorities and look to right size and set a deliverable program. So please note that the key thing here is we're excluding One New Zealand Stadium at Te Kaha. So all this analysis is excluding that. So this is the rest of the program excluding One New Zealand Stadium. So just background and some context. So currently the draft capital program in the draft annual plan is 643.6 million. And that's up from a current budget of 548 million this year. So that's a 17.5% increase. We're currently forecasting against this year a $500 million spend. So that would imply that it's $144 million higher than what we're currently looking to deliver, which is a 29%. As per the graph, you can see that the key areas and the areas that are particularly changing are wastewater and transport. And there's the big bulge that's circled there on the graph is largely being driven by the wastewater bulge in the sort of second colour up, the sort of mid-purpley colour is where the bulge is. So what we wanted to understand is what's driving some of this uplift in some of these projects. And so what we look to do is identify some of the key projects that are driving that. And we've identified 9 projects that we're sort of deeming to be non-core program or projects. And these projects are sort of being delivered separately, they're resourced and managed separately, and they're delivered in addition to what we're calling the core program. So the 9 projects listed there are the activated sludge at the treatment plant, the wastewater at Akaroa, the Grassmere wet weather storage facility, Omokahi South Library replacement, Akaroa Wharf, Robert McDougall Gallery, base isolation and strengthening, Canterbury Provincial Chambers and Performing Arts Precinct. The reason the Performing Arts Precinct are there is that some of that current year, the budget for that, some of that sits in outer years, which we're going to have to bring back because we're delivering it. Well, it's all but delivered now. So for comparative, I needed to put that in there because otherwise it doesn't make sense in relation to what we're doing now in terms of current year delivery. So those are the projects that we think we want to assess separately and go through reviewing how they sit and where they are and from a delivery perspective. And then we'll look at the rest of the program. So if you take those projects out of the program and look at what it looks like in terms of the profile after those projects are taken out, you can notice that large bulge that was sitting near the bottom is now largely eliminated. It's not flat, but it is largely eliminated. And the profile of the total program is much flatter, although it does look like it's continuing to climb from now right out to 2034. And I'll come back and talk to that a little bit more in a minute. So just looking at those 9 projects for a start and looking at where we're at in terms of delivery and how we're positioned to deliver those, we're looking to rephase or suggesting we rephase 4 of those. And the table there indicates what we're looking to rephase and to where. So that would rephase $18.3 million based on the current delivery profile and what we think can be delivered based on what budget's sitting there right now in 2026. And that would leave the core program at 67.3 million out of what started out being the 85.6. So that would be, we're talking about delivering that on top of the core program. So then looking at the core program itself, so just revisiting that graph again, so it is continuing to increase right out to 2034 in terms of the end of the current LTP. But how much of that actually relates to inflation adjustments we've put on the program rather than just what projects we're delivering. So when we eliminate the adjustment that's added for inflation, the profile changes to what's sitting there now. So it's much flatter. We hit a peak in 2027, but then it largely flattens out. It dips away and started to come back a bit, but it sort of averages out after the 2027 year. So that indicates really that the program is not changing a lot. Some of that increase, or a large chunk of that increase in that earlier graph, is actually being driven by inflation, particularly the adjustments we're using on the program for inflation. So the increases in 26, as I've said, are largely driven in transport and 3 waters. So $27 odd million is in the transport space and 35.8 in the 3 water space, and there's been some small reductions in the rest of the program in the other years. So then if we look at, so one of the questions is what phase are the projects sitting at that we're looking to deliver next year? Because the phase drives a lot of what will happen in terms of spend, and the most significant spend for most projects, well, all projects really sits in the construction phase. As a rough rule of thumb, about 80% of the total budget is spent in the construction phase, about 15% in pre-construction and about 5% post-construction. Rough rule of thumb. Not every project fits in that profile, but roughly that's where it would sit. So when we look at next year's program and understand where the projects sit in terms of a project life cycle, we can see that about 78% of the projects sit in a design phase or later. But more importantly, 41% already now sit in construction. So 41% are already in the construction phase now in the current year. And 6% are currently being procured, so are likely to be ready to be constructed next year. So that's 47%. So almost half of the program is pretty much close to in construction or about to be in construction, and is likely to be there by the time we get to 1 July this year. If we know what phase a project's in, then we may be able to use historical data to tell us what sort of percentage or dollar value are we likely to spend of that budget that's sitting there. Obviously, a project won't sit in that phase for the whole year. It will move through the phases as it goes through the normal life cycle of a project. But if we know where it is at the start of the year and where it ends up in terms of spend, what does that look like? So we looked at the last 3 years' data and had a look at where projects were sitting at the beginning of the year and how much they spent throughout that year, to look at what sort of value or what sort of percentage was spent. And so what we got to was, if a project's sitting in concept, generally speaking, about 80% of that budget of that project, so it's not 80% of the total project budget, it's 80% of the budgets that's sitting in that year for that project. So 80% of it sitting in concepts spent or likely to be spent. 75% in design. So if it's sitting in design at the beginning of the year, we tend to spend about 75%. If it's sitting in procure, about 90%. And if it's sitting in construction, we actually spend about 110%, which just means that we're bringing some of that budget back from future years because we didn't quite get it phased right in terms of the construction and when it's actually going to fall. So then what we looked at doing is, okay, if we know this information, can we then use that to sort of inform what's likely to happen in 2026? So what we did was take the 26 numbers. So this is just for the core program. So this excludes the 9 projects we talked about earlier. So taking the core program, which is 558 million, and applying those percentages, it would mean that it would forecast that we're likely to spend somewhere around the 510 million. So of the 558, we're likely to spend somewhere around about the 510. Now, these are just percentages and they're just estimates, but it gives us a bit of an idea of the likely spend of about 510, which means that there's about $48 million worth of projects that we're unlikely to spend the budget. So that's there. What you also have to remember is, even if we then took that $48 million out of the program and started with a 510 budget, those percentages would still apply. So we would still not deliver 100%. We would still only deliver, if that was 510 of our starting number, we would still only deliver those percentages against the 510. So our forecast delivery against 510, if we reduced it by 48 million, would still be something less than 510, probably something like 480-ish of the 510. So whatever number we start with, we're unlikely to deliver 100%. So the other thing we had a look at is, what are the drivers of the core program? So in terms of, is it a replacement of existing assets? Is it meeting additional demand, or often referred to as growth? Or is it an improved level of service? So just to get an idea of the sorts of projects we're delivering and what sort of categories they fall into, primary driver only. So a number of projects will fall into one driver, multiple drivers, but we're just looking at the primary driver. So there you can see about 50% of the program roughly is renewals. The grey bit in the middle is the growth, which sits reasonably steadily in the middle there. And there's peaks and troughs in the improved level of service. And sometimes that's where we're just delivering one new project particularly that falls into improved level of service, while you get often some of those spikes, particularly out towards 27. But the other thing is to note is that the increase in renewals from 25 to 34 it's going up by 56.6 million. So roughly 5 or so million per year. So then what we also looked at is the business units particularly went through their program and independently of what I've just talked about, and had a look at their program and looked at each of the projects that are to be delivered in 26 and rationalise whether we can or can't deliver to that level of budget in 2026. So when we took into account those factors and looked at the deliverability of that core program, looking at it project by project, we identified a number of projects that we think need to be rephased based on what we can actually deliver against those projects for next year. And what we're proposing there is to rephase $53.2 million of it based on the current delivery profiles. So that would take the core program, if we did go through and rephase those projects, not reduce them, not take them out, but just rephase them based on current expected delivery of those projects, then the core program would drop from 558 million down to 504, 505 million dollars. So, and the table there just indicates where we'd rephase some of those projects to and the different activities they fall in. So, and it's also interesting that this was done independently of that analysis I did before about the percentage by phase, and the number that we came out there was about the 50 odd million dollars, and doing it project by project, looking at where we're at today and what do we think we can deliver next year, they actually come out as a similar number. Not identical, but similar. So it tends to indicate that we're probably on about the right numbers, give or take a little bit, but there's definitely some sort of rationale for that, even though we went about these two activities independently. They weren't linked. So then, how does that revised core program at 505, how does that compare with what we're looking to deliver this year? So currently 500 million this year. However, that 500, what we have to remember is that 500 million that we're currently forecasting this year includes the 9 projects that we said we're taking out that are non-core. So that 500 needs to be adjusted by those 9 projects. So it's no use just comparing that 500. That'll be a bit artificial, comparing that with 505, because it would be very nice and go, oh, 500, 505, they're almost the same. But it's not really 500 that we're delivering this year on the core program. So if we take out the current forecasts for those 9 projects, they're approximately 50 million. It was 48 point something, so call it 50 million. So that would bring the delivery, the forecast delivery for the program this year to 450. So then we're comparing the 450 to the 505, not 500. So 450 to 505, which would indicate about a 12% increase on that. If we size the program to about 505 for the core program, that would be a 12% uplift on the current year's forecast delivery. And that would reduce the total program down by 71 million for the two, the non-core and core. So that would bring the total program down to 572 million, started out at 644. And then just where does that sit and what does it look like? So effectively, there's the 572 is the plan. So we started out with the 644 minus the 18.3 million for the non-core, 50 minus the 53 that we just talked about for the core would give you 572. And then when you just look at that program by the core, non-core program, what does it look like going forward? In that second table, the core program comes down to 504.8. But then what we do need to look at is what happens to it when it's going forward. Because we then go to 619 or 620, 627, 618. Those numbers need more work. We also have to factor in what we don't deliver this year. We're currently sitting on about 50 million that is going to be undelivered from this year's budget. That will need to be most of that will need to be carried forward. We will aim, and we have achieved in the last 2 years, a net nil in the following year. So our objective, and we will achieve it, I'm pretty sure, is get no net carry forward increase into 2026. But that does mean that we've got to put 50 million into 27 or later. So those numbers from 27 through probably to 28 or 29 potentially is where that 50 million. So those numbers will go up by the carry forward from this year. So, and we appreciate that those are right now, based on the analysis we've just been through, those numbers are not deliverable as we sit here today and will need to be redressed as part of the ongoing annual plan process, not the current annual plan, but the next annual plan, and certainly the LTP, where we'll need to look at some of the analysis we've done now and apply that to the next LTP particularly, and annual plan, and look at what we present as part of a capital program going forward, because right now on our delivery, we wouldn't be able to deliver what we're putting in front of you. And so we appreciate that and know that more work needs to be done in that space. In terms of some of that, we do need to work on some of the internal processes to try and deliver a bit more. Earlier I presented where we're looking at to deliver more renewals and replacements, so we do need to be able to do some uplift in the program to be able to cope with some of that, because that's only looking after what we've already got. So we need to focus on being able to deliver more renewals in the renewal space, particularly because as each year goes by, our asset base gets bigger, so we're going to need to be able to deliver more renewals. So we do need to focus on improving some of our processes to be able to deliver a bit more. If we went ahead and made those changes to the program that were outlined earlier, we'd have the following rates impacts. So would reduce the rates by 0.2 in 2026 and 0.51 in 2027. So it's because effectively any change in the capital programs over 2 years, the rates impacts over 2 years, not one. About 1/4 of that change is year one, and about 3/4 of the change is in year two. So therefore there's the -0.2 and the -0.5 for the $71 million change in program. So that's the rates impact. So that's largely the analysis and points we wanted to raise around what we're looking to do. So our recommendation is to reduce the program by the numbers we've outlined earlier, and happy to take questions and have some discussion on what we've presented and what we want to do going forward.
Great, thanks, Paul. We'll start with Andre. No further, thank you. Victoria.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks, team. This is a really great piece of work, and it really is the science behind the data that I was asking for. It's the show me. So I'm really pleased with this piece of work. It gives me a lot more confidence. It does beg the question, how did you forecast prior to this? That's the first part of the question. And the second bit is, conscious that our PMO forecast is often different to your team's forecast, which is often different to the budget forecast. So how do we now capitalise on this piece of work to ensure that we've got more alignment in our forecasting going forward? Because otherwise we're just going to be repeating this exercise again and again and again.
Agreed. So the PMO forecast is a top-down, effectively it's a top-down forecast. So what we look at is historical trends, what we expect to happen, some of the analysis I presented here as well, and go top-down, what do we think we can deliver based on what we know historically. The project manager forecast is what we'd call a bottom-up. So that's project by project, adding them all up gives a total forecast by project. But each project manager is likely to be somewhat biased between their own project and what they can deliver and what they think they can deliver. And of course, when you add up 1,100 projects with a little bit of optimism in each, you get quite a lot of optimism overall. And so that's why often at the beginning of the year, there's quite a vast difference between the PMO forecast and the project manager forecast. And as the year goes on and there's more certainty at a project manager level, what you'll often see is their forecast comes down and it starts coming towards the PMO. You'll notice that the PMO forecast this year hasn't really changed much. We've just changed it 10 million this month that we're reporting at F&P tomorrow. But largely we've held pretty strong on 510 pretty much all year, now 500. But yeah, the thing is when we do the PMO analysis, we don't know. We know some projects will fall over. The problem is often at the beginning of the year, we're not sure which ones. And as I say, a lot of the project managers and program managers always have a little bit of optimism. So effectively, we know some projects won't go as fast as we hope. And we know that there's some projects we can probably speed up because we've got through processes faster. So, but if you asked for the PMO to give you which projects, we can't because we don't actually know.
Look,
so we're doing it on a more holistic basis, whereas project managers do it on a more granular basis.
Thank you. I really appreciate that to help me understand it. And I think I can cope with the the difference in the sums, knowing that this piece of work is being done by your team. So I've got two more questions, if I may. We note that the numbers are going up going forward. So did I hear you correctly that you'll then repeat this exercise as you go into each annual plan and the long-term plan? Yep.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you did say that you need to deliver more renewals, otherwise we're going to keep just falling behind. So how are you proposing to do that, and what does that piece of work look like?
So there's a number of things we need to have a look at there, but we need to firstly have a look at process, is what processes, and some of this work has been done by the infrastructure working group, is some of the stuff we're working through there, which will come back to council once we've finished that work. So some of the discussions we're starting in that space to look at some of the process and how we manage some of the processes internally. We're always going to get tripped up by some things, like consenting is one of the issues that we've had, particularly this year, a little bit last year, this year, and probably will go forward into next year. What that's done is that we've often got our phasing wrong because we've been overly optimistic on when we'll get a resolution on some of those consents, and so we're not allowing enough time and time contingency against that time as well. So we're anticipating we're going to start construction much earlier than we are, and of course the big spend is construction. So if we forecast that to happen early, it looks like we're going to spend a lot better than we are, or than we end up doing. So that's one of the things we need to look at. So we do need to look at forecasting, need to look at realistically scheduling or time, in terms of, are we allowing enough time for some of these phases of a project? Consultation, consenting if it needs consents, which sort of consent is it, internal or external consents? How long have they been taking? So take some of the lessons we've been learned and put them in practice is some of the things that we need to do.
Thank you. There was just one final question, and that's on page 12 of your slide. I had to read this a number of times to get my head around it. If you can go back to page 12. It's the bit at the bottom there. It must, however, be remembered that wherever the program is at the beginning of the year, the above percentages would still apply. 100% of the program would not still be delivered. So when you spoke to that, you said, so even if we adjust the figures and forecast it back to 510, we still know that we're only going to achieve 480.
Yeah.
Just help me understand that piece as to why we don't put 480 in the budget. I still can't get that little piece.
We can't, and no council's ever delivered 100% of their program. And that's the fundamental issue, is and the other thing we can't identify is which projects won't we deliver this far out.
So that allows you to have a bit of an overs and unders.
Yes.
Okay.
So effectively, that's the difference. Wherever we start, and currently we're looking at spending, or our forecast spend is over 90%. We anticipate that won't change, and it will be over 90% again next year. But there will be that 8 to 10 that we won't spend for unknown reasons right now. And that's what I mean by that, is that we'll never... You need to apply those percentages to whatever your starting number is.
It's a formula, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a formula.
Yeah, I think a couple of years and I might have figured that out by now, but thank you.
I was going to say,
I'm
can you
really
just
good with that.
clarify, we don't borrow it all up front either. So we adjust it by not borrowing it until we need it. So we don't borrow the 480 up front.
Which is why the
I'm really good.
forecast...
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased with this piece of work.
Yeah, which is why the forecast becomes really important, because that's how our Treasury can help manage that funding.
Thank you.
Tyrone?
So many questions. I guess, what's the question I want to ask? So, looking ahead to the annual plan for next year, so we get presented with a line by line view of the capital program, which we can all analyse to our heart's content.
Correct.
Now, when we sign off the annual plan, what confidence can we have that the annual plan that we signed off with the capital program that we signed off is, because there's going to be this gap between what we think the market can deliver and what project managers think that they can deliver, and project managers, as discussed, will tend to have an optimism bias, and it's being built up from over 1,000 projects or whatever. So how can we, as a governance group, sign off on a capital program that we think is deliverable in terms of money, which has a direct impact on the rating, versus what versus the capital program that project managers think that they can deliver, and how do we reconcile that gap?
Well, hopefully from the analysis we've presented today, that gives you more confidence on what can or can't happen in terms of what we've done in the past. So if you went with the recommendations we're making here in terms of reducing the program, we're saying that that's a 12% uplift on the current delivery, current forecast delivery for current year, and we think that that's achievable. But we know that it won't be 100%. We know whatever number we come up with and you sign off as the capital program for the annual plan, I can tell you now we won't deliver 100%.
Paul, can you just also clarify that because it's a 10-year program, or sometimes even longer, during the course of the year, you can move money or bring back money. If things are speeding up or going out, there can be, if some projects slowing down, you can bring back money for another program as long as you don't spend over that total spend.
Total spend, yeah. So what we're trying to do constantly is juggle the carry forwards and bring backs, if you like. So it's those projects that are slowing down for whatever reason, and there's usually some very good reasons for some of them. Then as soon as we identify those projects, we look at what's the next cab off the rank in terms of that program of work, and can we accelerate it? And then we look to accelerate those projects to try and fill that gap in terms of total program delivered.
Yep.
Now, sometimes we can match those off quite nicely and it works quite well, and other times it doesn't. But that's why we end up with a gap, because effectively the stuff that slows down we can't always fill, because at this time of the year, if something falls over now, there's no way we can accelerate anything fast enough to fill this year. So it's going to be a hole. And so anything that falls over in the second 6 months of the year, roughly, is unlikely to be filled. We might fill a little bit of it, but not all of it, generally speaking.
There is another piece as well in regards to land sales that can tip us over as well if they don't go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Depending on those.
Can I have a follow-up? Is that all right, please? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're on track to deliver a capital program of X Te Kaha of approximately, I mean, it's give or take $500 million.
500 million, correct.
Right. And so next year, I mean, I'm keen to know what the core underlying assumption is of what we can deliver next year. And, you know, like, let's just say that there is some uplift from 500 million. Maybe we can do 510 because we get more market share because of what, you know, whatever, there's more capacity available. So if the, how can I explain this? So, sorry, I've just got to try and think through it. So if we can deliver, if we believe that our core underlying assumptions mean that we can do a $510 million capital program, and the sum total of all the projects that make up that program adds up to 600 million. Is there a facility through which we as a governance group can sign off on a capital program of $510 million, and you guys go away and figure out what projects need to be pushed out and reduced, and you know, and so all of our rating calculations are based on a $510 million program rather than the $600 million program that all the projects make up.
Well, that's the guidance we're going to be seeking as part of the annual plan deliberations. So that's the sort of thing that we will want. We're looking for, particularly the first briefing is on the 19th of May, is my understanding, and that's where we're looking for direction on, do you want to go down the track we've identified and demonstrated here today? Do you want to take that up, or is it something else that you're looking to do?
That's good.
But yeah,
that is exactly the answer. No, thank you.
Mary, did you want to add?
No,
You're right. Okay. Any other questions?
That's really
good. Oh, sorry, Celeste.
In terms of like getting more visibility at a program level for things like looking through the list, you've got tsunami warning systems rephased from this financial year to FY28.
26 to 28, yep. Next year to the year 28, yep.
Just looking at the long-term plan here.
Yeah.
So I think it's this year.
This year we've got about $1 million,
Yep.
roughly. Yeah, this year's about $1 million.
Yep. So being pushed out, if we're concerned about that, where do we get visibility of what the rationale is? Because we don't have the level of detail that would help us understand that.
I mean, some of it is in the, if there are large variances, they come up as part of the monthly report. So those projects that have the biggest variances sit on the monthly reports that we present to F&P. They're at the bottom of the table on each of the different areas. So if they've got a large variance, and tsunami will definitely be towards the top end of that at about $1 million, they will come up there. But also, yeah, that's the only real visibility we have at a project level, because otherwise we'd have to give you all 1,100 odd projects every month.
So if it's not on the capital watch list, where do we get the visibility?
You get less visibility, yes.
So something like, so the tsunami one, you'll remember you were briefed on about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but we can bring a briefing back about
It didn't reference any rephasing of funding. In fact, I thought we were looking at...
Because there's a review around the sirens and what type of sirens we put in.
My understanding was the review would implied that we were speeding things up, not rephasing it. So, and there's a few there, like the Estuary Edge project, which I've seen this question through around. We received a memo to say that project would be delivered in FY27 based upon the current timing, yet it's being pushed out to FY28. So I don't know how we'd push the money out till after the project's finished. So I'm just confused about some of the projects.
Right now on some of those, so like Estuary Edge, for example, right now we haven't got a solution, haven't got the final solution on the consent. So right now, we don't know exactly when we can start the construction. If we can start the construction in 2027 and finish it in 27, we will. We will just bring the money back that's sitting in 28 and put it into 27. We will always start and try and deliver the projects as fast as we possibly can. If the money sits outside that delivery timeframe, then we will bring the money back to support the delivery of that project. And the classic example at the moment right now is the Court Theatre is about to open, yet some of the budget sits in next year, 2026.
I can understand that. There needs to be a degree of flexibility there. I guess what I'm trying to understand is we recently got that memo specifying that is the timeline. So that's the most recent update.
Yep.
Yet this report is quite different. So understanding for those particular projects, not every project, but there'll be some significant projects where that kind of delay is quite significant to those who are watching this going, why would that be?
We're not saying that the project is delayed. What we're saying is the funding is not entirely aligned with the current delivery, but we're not entirely sure when the delivery will be. Best endeavours will be 2027. That doesn't mean that all of the money has to be in 2027.
Okay, I might need a bit of clarification on that one, particularly. Thank you.
Okay, Mel. It's a bit of wizardry.
With the projects rephasing these amounts, it's hard to tell. These are portions of budgets, aren't they? And
yes,
so
correct.
It's hard to tell looking at this if that's 10% or 100% or 50 or whatever of each project. So it's hard to tell.
Yep.
In context, I guess is probably the main comment I've got about this.
What we'll do is circulate the change with the current proposed and change. We'll circulate it after this to everybody to show you on the projects listed at the last 3 slides on what that is, what it looks like. Nearly every project will continue to have budget in the 2026 year. And in fact, those that don't have a significant carry forward from 2025 or the current year. So then some of that would go to make it up. But yes, we're happy to circulate that information after this.
Thanks. Sam?
Hey, thank you for this. This is really good work, and it explains it really well. And I think it's kind of the science that we were looking for, the data that validates getting some comfort over where we're at. So well done. I just wondered, the first one is if we look at the rates impact. So yep, completely get that there's a quarter in the next year and then it flows on. But am I right in thinking that FY28 out is just a reflection of we haven't applied this practice to the rest of the annual plans, to the capital programs each year?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Yes.
So we're actually, as we get into next year, we're likely to see that flow on significantly more.
Yes, that's just for these adjustments only.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Not the ongoing. You're right. Yep.
No. Good as gold. And the other one, where was it? Maybe come back to me, Pauline, if you've got others, but if not, don't worry. It's slipped my mind.
Well, I was just going to quickly squeeze one in there that the community centres renewals and replacements, is that across many centres or is it just one?
Across many, and it's just really rephasing it based on current delivery profiles of those centres that we're looking to do work in the next year.
Thank you.
So total budget doesn't change.
Yanni?
Yeah, I was just interested in a number of the cycleways being pushed out as well. Like, it would seem to me that should be kind of an annual plan decision, not a, like, well... Sorry, so the ones that are proposed to be rephased have already been rephased, have they?
No. These will come back to you as part of the annual plan discussions and briefings.
Sorry, let me be more clear. In terms of like rephrasing these ones, this should be consulted on as part of the annual plan. Like, the community obviously feel very passionately one way or another on a number of these projects, but they would actually get no say in the prioritisation if we just do it as part of this annual plan, given that we've closed submissions. So that was kind of the concern, really.
Can I just remind, this was a resolution you made at the time of adoption of the draft annual plan to ask for advice on rephasing the capital program. So
Right.
this, we probably didn't introduce this.
Okay.
This is responding, and this is the first briefing
sure.
that will feed into your
Okay.
final decision.
And that was also in
But, like,
response to losing the subsidies
Maybe it's
as
good
well.
if I just use an example, like Pages Road Bridge. I can't think of anyone in that community that would say, "Oh, that's cool, delay it for another year." Like, the signal that will
But don't
send.
forget, it's not necessarily delayed.
Well, we can say that, but time and time again, where we've had money on budget in certain years and it's been put out a year, then we've told, sorry, now it's not happening, or it's happening later, and it gets further and further behind, right? So maybe we understand that.
I
as
wonder,
councillors.
just Pauline, if it's okay, whether the team could just explain again
I was just going to say that.
the process around this is the funding, not the project.
Yeah.
And so when there are movements on here, that is the funding. It's not all the funding. It is some of the funding.
Sure, I
to reflect
understand.
the spend profile. So,
But maybe-
no, stop. So rather than us confuse people watching online, can the team just be really clear and talk through that again?
Yes.
Well, sorry, and can we just get some legal advice or around what would trigger a need to reconsult? Like, what would trigger a point where the community's views should be sought if we're making
Can we just get the team to clarify, because it will answer Yanni's questions like it did the first time for everyone?
Thank you, Councillor McDonald. Paul, would you like to go through that once again, please?
So where we're moving the funding around, it is to try and support the delivery of the project and where we think the funding needs to sit. It's not until we actually let a construction contract that we actually know where the funding really needs to sit. So it is a bit of a wet finger in the air, if you like, in terms of thinking where it should sit. But it is what we think it's going to happen today. But the problem is to align the funding with the delivery of the project. We can't do that till we actually have a construction contract to get it really right. And so it's just an estimate. But that doesn't mean that the project has necessarily been delayed if we rephase some of that funding.
Because when we already do this, we already bring budgets forward and push them out. But what you're doing is applying this formula so that you can have a greater ability to predict where it actually sits, quite likely, and it doesn't preclude it being moved forward.
Moved around, no. It's only a predictor, and that's all we can do right now is predict.
Yep.
We have more certainty over than others, but it's a prediction.
Thank you. Yep.
If we're using the Pages Road Bridge example, and probably an answer for the chief executive potentially is if something happened and it was sped up, or there was something that was achieved and there was more money required on the project, nothing's changed in that there's a $5 million delegation to you, and then the rest of it comes to F&P to bring it forward.
Yep. And potentially, just so it's clearer to the public, if we're clarifying this, we'll call this the capital program budget as opposed to the capital program, because that's making it really clear that this is about what we're budgeting year on year to deliver the capital program.
Yeah, so the Northern Line, the rail crossing's been delayed for 3 years. So that's like
I think you've got to once again be careful using those words
Sorry.
delayed.
Okay,
It's
sorry. The
predicted that
funding
that'll
is
be
changing from 2028 to 2031.
And so there may be reasons for
So-
that out of our control. This is what sits behind all this.
Yeah.
And we've already been told everything will be delivered earlier if possible.
But effectively, at what point does the community say, actually, we think you should prioritise doing this sooner rather than later, or you should keep the same budget in place because we want this done, versus us saying we're going to push these things up?
The budget timing doesn't reflect when it's going to be done. This is, as Mary said, this is a budget. It's not the project.
Scrutton's Road, 2028.
Okay, you're going to go through line by line. Celeste.
Just going back to the budgets, if, say, I understand the rephasing thing, if you bring something else forward because you go, well, I'm going to do a substitution because I can do this earlier, which makes sense, doesn't that then mean that that other project might, because we've had this problem before and then we've kind of gone, we'll bring these things forward and we'll push those things out, it's just part of the rephasing process, but now we can't actually do those things that were previously there because we brought these other things forward and this is all we can deliver. So it is, from what I understand, there is two parts to it. One is you're moving things around. The other part is when you do those swaps out, swap in and swaps out, in terms of budget, it does have an impact on what's delivered. Is that not how it works?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So part of it is looking to try, it really depends on why a project is being delayed. What's causing the delay on the project, and then trying to predict when that will be fixed or no longer a problem, and we can get back on with delivery. So for example, consenting. Sometimes we have no idea how long it's going to take to get a final solution and get a final outcome. And then the final outcome might mean that we actually need to do some more redesign work on that based on what we've now got as a consent. So then that could push the project out even further in terms of the actual construction. So until you actually resolve some of the reasons why a project's being delayed, you can't always predict how long it's going to take.
And we want to keep on delivering. So
we
that's
will
why
keep
have to
delivering.
reprioritise.
Yeah, that's right.
So if something was pushed out because there was a consenting issue, but then we resolved that issue,
Yes.
but you'd put some other things ahead of it, which then lifted the total budget. Would you then also deliver the thing you'd pushed out because you've resolved that issue? Would you bring the money back in?
We will be looking to try and deliver that project, yes, as well. And that's the decision we need to make when we're bringing projects forward. Are we going to hamper overall delivery by bringing that project forward? So sometimes we will not look to bring a project forward because we think we can get a quick resolution. Now, sometimes that doesn't work and we're wrong, but sometimes we wouldn't substitute a project because we think we've got a quick win, and then we don't want to take that capacity away from the delivery team, and then we'll try and deliver it, but sometimes we'll get that wrong.
Thank you. Victoria, and that might be the last one.
Yeah, thank you. It's just a line item on page 20. I see it, about a third of the way down, you've got 41663. You're taking out 0.1, 0.7 and 0.5 for Harewood Road traffic signals, but then you put them back in on the bottom line under 81843
Yes.
for exactly the same piece of work for the exactly the same sums. Can you just explain that to me?
Slightly different pieces of work. So they are both in relation to that intersection. The first line is the actual intersection work. The second line, we wanted to separate out the related work around the intersection, such as stormwater management and other things, to keep that separate. So we wanted to identify is the project to do the intersection, which is 41663, and then there's consequential work we need to do around that intersection to complete the project, and we wanted to have it in a separate line item.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of that briefing. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
And the clarity of explanation. It's a complicated piece of work, and if I see any crystal balls on sale downtown, I'll grab you one. Thank you. Yep. And now we come to local water done well. And this is a summary of the consultation and a briefing on the next steps. Luke and David. Oh. And Paddy. Brent. Right. Welcome, team. Luke, Brent, Paddy. Fire away.
So, as council are aware, we've been out and consulted on the options that we previously presented to you, and we've just got a presentation here today that Luke's prepared prior to this coming back to council next week for a decision. So I'll hand over to Luke.
Cool. Yep. So this session, obviously, we're going to summarise the consultation feedback that we had. We'll run through some of the background first, just to rehash that. It won't be onerous. I'll go through it as quickly as possible, but just to set the scene. So we'll go through the framework in the legislative context, the water services delivery models that we consulted on, a summary of the evaluation we did before the consultation, and then we'll get into what we heard in the consultation itself. And then we'll talk about next steps. So this one's pretty clear. We've run through this many times. Local water done well. It's a centrally driven reform aimed to address New Zealand's long-standing water infrastructure issues. There's a big emphasis on local flexibility. However, it puts a strong focus on compliance with centrally directed requirements. So the key things are water services must be financially sustainable. The delivery model must be fit for purpose, and there's an expectation that the new stricter rules for water and infrastructure quality will drive more investment, or the appropriate investment. In terms of the framework, it's been phased, the legislative framework's been phased in 3 key pieces of ledge. So the first one being the Water Services Repeal Act. So that repealed the previous 3 waters legislation and restored direct council ownership and responsibility for water. Then we've got the Local Government Water Services Preliminary Arrangements Act that established the Local Water Done Well framework and requires councils to develop and submit a water services delivery plan by 3rd of September 2025. And then finally, there's the Local Government Water Services Bill. So this is likely, or they're telling us it's going to be enacted mid-2025. This sets the enduring legislative framework for water services delivery. Submissions on the bill closed on 23rd of February. We provided a submission for that, and the Finance and Expenditure Committee will report on the bill, including any recommended changes on or by the 17th of June.
By the when?
17th of June.
Oh, thanks. That's on there.
A fundamental part of the framework is producing a water services delivery plan. So that's the first step in the thing that we're concentrating on at the moment. It needs to detail our current water infrastructure and assets and anticipate our future investment needs. It outlines our financial and operational strategies that we'll use to meet the new regulatory standards, and it needs to be finalised, endorsed by council and submitted to the Department of Internal Affairs by the 3rd of September this year. Critically, which is the topic of today, is it must include the council's proposed water services delivery model. As mentioned previously, the Water Services Bill that outlines the delivery models that the councils can choose. So there's a tight list there. So we had the options of delivering services directly, so that's the in-house model. You can transfer responsibility to a water organisation, so that would be a CCO, for example. Contract with third parties for service delivery while retaining governance and control within council. We can enter joint arrangements with other councils, so that would be setting up a regional CCO, for example. We can join another CCO and if there are any other compliant arrangements, we could investigate those as well. Basically, there's a provision in there that means that if a water organisation is used, it needs to be a company, but that's a company owned by councils or a consumer trust. In terms of water service delivery models that we evaluated and consulted on, we evaluated in detail and consulted on 3 models. The first one, keeping water services in-house. So this was our proposal for consultation. This is where direct control is retained within council's existing structure, and with retaining the local oversight and integration with other council services. Then we've got a water services CCO, so that separate legal entity focused solely on water services management. It would be owned by City Council, and the key thing with that was that the board would need to be a professional competency-based board and cannot include council staff or council elected members. And a Two Waters CCO, bit of a hybrid model of the both, so keeping stormwater under council management while having water supply and wastewater transferred to a CCO. In terms of a recap of evaluating or how we evaluated the options, we presented this to you in the interim business case in the report that came before the consultation. There's 2 key phases to that assessment. The first one being a strategic assessment. So this focused on the model's alignment with Christchurch's priorities, objectives and community expectations. And then we did a detailed financial assessment to validate the affordability and the sustainability of each approach. In terms of a recap on the strategic assessment, so at a high level, the in-house model scored the highest in terms of strategic fit for Christchurch. The key highlights were it leverages established council resources and processes, which provide stability and efficiency. It does avoid the significant transition costs and implementation risks of the other models, and it maintains direct accountability to the community through elected members, and governance is retained by council. Both of the CCO models scored well as well in terms of financial flexibility with their higher ability to borrow. It's also assumed that their specialist focus on water services could drive long-term efficiencies. However, in the short term, there would be high transition costs and governance complexity, especially when standing up the entity. And any viability or any improvements would be dependent on the CCO achieving these assumed efficiencies. In terms of the financial assessment, recap, all models can achieve long-term financial sustainability in terms of revenue sufficiency and balanced budgets. The in-house model provides the most predictable pathway with steady rates impacts, lower transition costs and borrowing capacity that's sufficient or more than sufficient for what our anticipated investment needs are. However, the CCO models offer greater borrowing headroom, but they do come with trade-offs, which we've mentioned, the higher setup costs, greater debt servicing pressures, and less flexibility in pricing structures. So I'll zoom through this. The in-house model was the proposal. It's well aligned with Christchurch's needs. It had a balanced evaluation outcome. It builds on our existing systems. It is financially prudent and predictable, and it is flexible and adaptable. However, the CC options were highly credible alternative options as well. They provide credible pathways for delivering safe, reliable and financially sustainable water services. However, it was noted that there is a high setup and transition costs. They require significant operational restructuring, which includes risks of disruption, and it is harder for council to modify or reverse structural changes once a CCO is established. So moving on to the main event is what we heard through the consultation. So consultation ran from 7th of March to 6th of April this year. There were 681 submissions in total. Of those, 612 indicated a preference. The proposal, so the in-house delivery model, was preferred by 80% of those that indicated a preference. A 3 waters CCO was 14% and a 2 waters CCO was 6%. So in terms of the overall picture, the in-house delivery model proposal was overwhelmingly supported. In terms of the feedback supporting the in-house model, there was a strong preference for local governance and accountability through elected members. There was a desire to retain public ownership and avoid any perceived risks of privatisation. However, I will note that the legislation does have explicit statutes in it preventing this from happening. There were concerns about the added overheads and costs under each CCO model. And there was a general belief that council has successfully managed water services to date. And there was a preference for integrated delivery across council services. So the common sentiment there was don't fix what isn't broken. In terms of the feedback and the comments for those that supported the 3 waters CCO, there was a desire for a depoliticised long-term infrastructure planning. There's a belief in improved transparency and governance through a specialised board. It was viewed as being more efficient and commercially focused. It was seen as providing better long-term value to ratepayers, and it was perceived to better align with national standards and regulation. So again, the common sentiment for these comments were a specialist focus ensures smarter investment. And the feedback supporting the 2 waters CCO, again, very similar to the 3 waters CCO in terms of the decision-making cycles and the support for expert governance. However, there was strong recognition for council's strong stormwater integration and performance, and it was viewed as a compromise model, so combining specialisation with local delivery. Now, in terms of what we heard from Mana Whenua.
Yeah, kia ora koutou i ngā rakatira. I hope you had a well-earned Christmas break, Easter break, sorry. Look, we've spoken to all 6 papatipu. There were 5 main themes that had come through with that engagement. The first one being that council recognises rangatiratanga, that they looked at some shared solutions to address past and future issues, so, not making the same mistakes we did in the past. Genuine engagement and early engagement, the desire to co-design, and of course, governance. That's all I can tell you.
Yes, there was a strong message that came through around rangatiratanga and having the opportunity to be involved at the right time, potentially at the governance level with council going forward. That was a very strong message, both verbally and in writing from the Papatipu Reno.
Both the local Water Done Well teams and the treaty relationships team met face to face when we could. Some good positive feedback and a very strong emphasis in regard to earlier engagement.
So with that said, in terms of next steps, next week, 7th of May, Council will be asked to agree on the proposed service delivery model. So that's taking into account for consideration the consultation feedback and the previous analysis. And this would be for the inclusion in the water services delivery plan. It's a requirement, so we need to do this under the Local Government Water Services Preliminary Arrangements Act. it enables us to start planning in detail the next steps, especially in terms of the trickier parts of the water services delivery plan, and it will enable us to be on track to get it submitted by the 3rd of September.
Right, thank you.
Questions?
Do we have any questions? It was a very good presentation. Yanni?
Can we get what was put in writing from Mana Whenua? And I'm just keen to kind of
Party.
understand, like, have we just made, like we did for C4LD, like another mistake in terms of how we engage? Or is it
Can you address the question to
seen
the
as
party,
opportunity going forward?
please?
Yeah, sure. Look, we've had face-to-face meetings with 3 of the Papatipu. We've had 2 lots of submissions come through, one from the Papatipu Runanga and also from Naito. 2 declined to meet but provided verbal commentary. Happy to provide anything that's come through from Mana Whenua.
Thank you, that'd be good. And I'm just wondering how we'd go
Trying to
forward to
understand, like, have
engage
we-
probably through the Papatipu Runanga
Have we done
meetings
something
that we have.
wrong in terms of the start of this process, or are we looking forward? Like, just yeah.
Right.
Some of us raised this at the start.
I think from the previous presentation that we provided, we made it very clear that earlier engagement would have been a whole lot more beneficial. Yeah.
Cool.
And we've acknowledged that.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? No, but that's great. Thank you. So this is coming to our agenda next Wednesday, not tomorrow, next week. And then hopefully we can get on to sorting out the service delivery plan.
Yes.
So that's wonderful. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our briefings today. Thanks everybody. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.